Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Cindy Harn, Executive Director for the Nature Foundation of Will County, and I will be your host tonight for our very special evening with Doug Tallamy. I know we have quite a few of our donors and supporters joining us tonight, so thank you so much for your continued interest and your amazing generosity. For those of you joining us from areas outside of Chicagoland, or maybe you're new to our organization, we're a 501c3 nonprofit charity that raises money in support of the Forest Preserve District of Will County. We fund their programs and initiatives that protect nature, inspire discovery, and bring people and nature together. Before we get to Doug's presentation, I have just a few announcements. You're already muted. Thank you for keeping your videos off. If you're new to Zoom, you can adjust how you view this presentation in the upper right corner. Just look for view, and you can arrange things how you need to. We are recording right now, and we'll let you know when the recording is available for viewing. Also, if there's any follow-up information or links to information, we'll include that in the email with the link to the presentation. We will have time for questions afterwards, and if you have a question, please be concise and type it into the chat box. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, and we might run out of time, hard to say. I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question, but if there's a way we can answer that question in the follow-up email, we'll go ahead and do that. Tonight's presentation is the first in our Foundation's Learn and Grow series, and we are incredibly grateful for the generosity of our donors and corporate partners. We are 100% powered by donations, and their support keeps these seminars free of charge. If you'd like to support our work, there's a link on your registration confirmation or visit our website at willcountynature.org. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. We are so excited to have Doug Tallamy with us tonight. I remember the first time I saw Doug speak in person. It was way back in October of 2012, and he was in Bolingbrook. I'm sure you remember, Doug.
Oh, yeah.
He was presenting his research on the importance of caterpillars in raising a brood of chickadees, which really changed everything I thought about my role and responsibility as a gardener. That presentation was also the genesis for what was to become this foundation's signature event, the Bringing Nature Home Native Plant Sale, which is actually going on right now. It's an online plant sale, and then we'll have an in-person plant sale in May. And I'm sure Doug remembers, I reached out to him via email to ask him for his permission to name our plant sale Bringing Nature Home, and he said, go for it. Doug is extremely accomplished. Doug's an entomologist, ecologist, and conservationist. He's a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he's authored at least 80 research articles and has taught insect taxonomy, behavioral ecology, human and nature, and other courses for over 32 years. He's written and co-authored several books which have come to define the native plant movement. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the ways insects interact with plants and how these interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, here is nature's best hope, Doug Tallamy. Thank you, Doug.
Well, thank you, Cindy. We're going to have to update your CV. It's actually 41 years. So.
Oh my goodness. Well, I was
reading the one from back in
32. Nobody needs to know.
And the truth is, if it didn't happen last week, I don't remember it at all. But okay, we are going to talk about nature's best hope. I remember that much. But before we do that, let's talk about E.O. Wilson's 2016 book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. Of course, many of you know that Edward O. Wilson died the day after Christmas. He had a very long and extremely productive life, but he's still very sorely missed in the world of conservation. And one of the themes throughout his very long career was trying to save biodiversity on planet Earth. This book, Half Earth, probably was his culmination of that effort. He had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on the planet, we have to save nature. We have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. And then he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we'd actually do that. Conservation biologists, of course, are cheering. This is great. Let's save half of the earth. But half of terrestrial earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got just about 8 billion people and all of our airports and roads and detritus in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how could we actually do this? Well, that's what I want to talk about tonight. I do think we can realize EO's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do it. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns all at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, and it forced its head through there, and it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. Looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it popped down, and that's a dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. That's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. But you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground, wanted to come out the next year the way most insects would. And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave the acorn, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum in the acorn. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they leave an acorn. And if scouts find a new hole and a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new acorn in about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard here to make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree, and then they tap it below the surface of the soil. The object is they're going to go back and get that acorn in the wintertime and have something to eat. Well, for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're actually planting 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Androna facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only pollen, the only plant that they can use to reproduce on. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We have about 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could go on and talk about nature's specialized relationships pretty much forever. But my point is that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes right now. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And those typically are mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cows. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to support the amount of nature that we need to support in order to produce the ecosystem services that we humans need, that we depend on. You might wonder why we've done all that. I wonder why we've done that, and I don't know, but I suspect that we thought that the earth, our nest, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years, almost a third of our North American bird population already gone. Then the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. I don't know if you remember, but about 3 months ago, we removed 23 species from the endangered species list, not because we've saved them, but because they are extinct. So this is actually happening, but we can't allow it to happen. We depend on these species. So this is something we're going to have to address and stop. Okay, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses. But that is not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from a lot of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if we lost our insects, and he did it in 1987 with this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, even our freshwater fish, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news, and that is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on it. We're totally dependent on the life support that healthy ecosystems deliver us. We call them ecosystem services. Here are some of the things that plants do that we certainly benefit from, like the production of oxygen, like clean water. They're cleaning our water and slowing its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use, capturing carbon, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their root systems. Enormously important ecosystem service today. Plants build topsoil and they hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be a challenge. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a downright terrible idea because we need more ecosystem services today than ever before. We've got more people on the planet. Again, almost 8 billion of us. And we do have parks, we have preserves. They're doing the best they can, but they are too small, too isolated from each other, and too few to produce the amount of services that we need. So now we're going to have to start to do conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that for long periods, but our huge Western societies, our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time, that notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue this evening, though, is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head, and we have to practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where are we going to do that? Well, let's go back to private property. We have to do conservation on private property because most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. I think it's 95% of Texas, 92% of Maine. A lot of private property out there. We've got to practice conservation on private property, or we're going to fail. Now, when you talk about conservation, I'm not using the word correctly. We do want to conserve anything that is not already wrecked, absolutely, but we need to rebuild what we already have wrecked. And that's a form of restoration. And before you tell me that you're not going to put it back exactly the way it was, I know that, but it doesn't mean we can't reunite enough of those specialized interactions that are nature to recreate functioning ecosystems, even if they don't look exactly like they did before we came along. But in order to do that, there are a couple of founding fathers of any ecosystem. There's species that contribute more to ecosystems than other species, the building blocks. We need to start with them, then we can add the other species later on. And there's two groups we can't do without. One would be the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into food. Then they store that energy in their plant parts, mostly their leaves. So now we got all the energy that becomes food in plant parts. If we don't get that food to animals, we have no animals on the planet. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. And most of those invertebrates are insects. And it turns out that caterpillars are enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't support a lot of caterpillars, we have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee we have here. When you go farther north, it becomes the black-capped chickadee. Out west, there's the chestnut-back chickadee, and mountain chickadee, lots of chickadees around, but they're all doing pretty much the same thing. They are seed eaters during the wintertime. They're at our feeder eating seeds. 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they are reproducing in the spring, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects. And if they are in a healthy environment, they will feed their babies as many caterpillars as possible. And it turns out that they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? There's a number of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that one of my grad students, Ashley Kennedy, did a couple of years ago. She put out a call to bird photographers across the country and said, please take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest, and then send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that are in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as possible. And she got a great response, thousands of pictures, did a lot of identifying. And this is a summary of her results for the 20 most common bird families in North America. The green bars are the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we designed landscapes that didn't have enough caterpillars. Most of our birds would not be able to successfully reproduce. So there's something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its cuticle, its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin, undigestible. Birds don't want a lot of chitin. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids? Forget one caterpillar. They're nutritious. They're high in fat, high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And many beetles have a lot of sharp edges too. And finally, it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate. Birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting the carotenoids from? From what they're eating, of course. But look, the carotenoid content of different bird prey is not equal. Caterpillars have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars down here. The moths and butterflies themselves, they have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves, and that's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting the caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need a lot of caterpillars. Or let's just say birds need caterpillars. So the next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Maybe one or two is enough. Maybe one or two a day is enough. Well, let's go back to chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, depending on the number of chicks in the nest, to get those chicks to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one nest of a tiny bird that's a third of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you would, because in so many places that's all we have, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, because chickadees only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if you don't have all of those caterpillars, all those insects in your yard, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly related to the bird declines that people are measuring, or at least one of the many causes of bird declines. We went to the original data from Rosenberg et al. That's a Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds, and we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like finches and doves that can reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of the seeds and they feed that to their young. Well, the birds that don't require insects didn't lose any numbers at all right there, but the birds that do require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. That doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly does suggest that as you take away bird food, you lose the birds. So we need to increase the objectives for when we landscape. In the past, we had one objective, and that was to make our landscapes pretty. One goal. Well, now we have to have two goals. We got to make our landscapes ecologically functional and pretty. With ecological function topping out the aesthetics. So we're not going to do that unless we have a lot of caterpillars in those landscapes. How do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you add the plants that make those caterpillars. That seems easy enough. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're going to choose. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy, and the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all of the calorie pear and all the burning bush and all the barberry and all of the camellias, all the zelkovas and ginkgos, all the things we typically landscape with in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly unless you have milkweeds. That is the only plant that it can develop on. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, in a few weeks when the leaves come out, go out and eat one. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. It's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. There's a reason we can't get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know that they're toxic. I'm kidding. But it is a really effective defense. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime, not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants, but because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat the plants for which they have developed particular adaptations to get around those chemical defenses. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect can't adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two lineages that are really similar in how they defend themselves. And they get good at getting around those by developing specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But once those adaptations fall into place, and it takes a long period of evolutionary history with the plants for those adaptations to fall into place, then the insect's locked into eating that particular plant. So if we take the milkweed out of our yards and put in hostas, the monarch's not going to start to develop on hostas. It's locked into milkweeds. And without milkweeds, it has two choices: leave and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters if we're trying to reconstruct food webs in places where we have dismantled them. We're going to have to choose the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000. We got part of a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. The last thing they did before they sold the farm was to mow it for hay. So there were very few woody plants there. So we wanted to restore the eastern deciduous ecosystem that it used to be. And you're not going to do that without bringing in the caterpillars. So I'll give you some examples of how we went about that. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet to make a living at my property. And people say, well, why'd you pick the Canadian owlet? I'd never even seen one. It was a very scientific reason. I looked in Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America, and I said, that's a pretty caterpillar. I want that one. So that's how I picked it. But you're not going to have Canadian owlets, and that's what the adult looks like. It looks just like a leaf. You're not going to have them unless you have meadow row. That is their host plant. They are host plant specialists, and we didn't have any meadow row. There used to be meadow row here, but the place was farmed to death for our property was farmed for over 300 years. So the meadow row is long gone. So I got some meadow row seeds from someplace and planted them, and it grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that that any Canadian owlets would be able to find my meadow row. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. One day I was walking by for another reason, and the meadow row was covered with Canadian owlets. They had come right away. I'm still surprised about that. So now we've got a good population of meadow row and Canadian owlets on the property. We have added 2 species, restoration. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there were some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. Went and got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my Bidens, but it finally did. And now we got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It used to be here. And as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry, planted it. Took 4 years for the butterflies to find my hackberry, but they finally did. Looked at one of my hackberry branches last June. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch. Now we've added 6 species. So this is how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. Goldenrod supports 110 species where I live. Planted Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's a good ground cover, has good fall color, can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down, makes nutritious berries for the birds in the fall, very high in fat. And actually, it's a very good pollinator plant too. You don't know that because its flowers are tiny and inconspicuous. The only time you know it's in bloom is when there's a big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're planting a pollinator garden, you're planting it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted the double-toothed prominent, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like that guy. It's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. We didn't have any American elm, lost it to the Dutch elm disease decades ago. But there are 2 big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. I got some seeds from them right after we moved in, planted them. They grew very nicely. They're now about 80 feet tall. And they brought in the double-toothed prominent. It was a great day when that happened. American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's a beautiful moth. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we had no evening primrose, so I planted that. And the moth came, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plants we put back in our yard, but I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is doing in your property, what it's delivering to your local ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks, most of my oaks, as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild that moth-based, caterpillar-based food web that supports so many other things by bringing in creatures like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oak worm, the orange-humped oak worm, the pink-striped oak worm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned eucalyptrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. Here's a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and there's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. And somebody said, oh, it's going to kill the tree. No, it's not. It eats just a little bit. It's through eating soon, and the tree will keep growing just fine. So this is what our property looks like, will look like in a few weeks when all those leaves come out. We have put a lot of plants back, not all of them, still working on it. Got a little lawn here, we're very traditional. But as my research progressed and we learned how important moths were to local ecosystems, I made it a goal to count all the species of moths that are now making a living on our property. And they're making a living on our property because we put the plants back. I am still at it, but so far, I've got 1,140 species of moths that I've taken pictures of. Now we've got 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1,240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded over, 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, here's another very scary statistic that we see pretty regularly. The World Wildlife Fund says Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I'm pretty sure that we have, actually, I'm very sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. And it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. All we did was put the plants back, and they replenished themselves. So don't give up when you see headlines like this. They are very depressing, but you are not powerless. You can do something about it. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres. A lot of people don't have that much land. Will it work on smaller properties, particularly in suburbia? That's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. When they moved into their property, which is in the middle of suburbia, by the way, surrounded by everybody with the big lawns, their property was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. Excuse me. So they got rid of all of that. Then they planted 75 species of native plants, put in a water feature they call a bubbler, and then sat back and started to count the birds using their property. And they are up to 149 species, including 35 warbler species. That's just an incredible number. Just to compare that to our house, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house, all on 0.6 acres. So yes, it can happen on smaller lots. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, she's got 1/10 of an acre. And look, that gray thing there is one of the towers at O'Hare Airport. She's right next to the airport. 1/10 of an acre is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a tiny little island. It's a beautiful island, but she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature. And then she sat back and started to count her birds. And I got to fix that number. It's 124 now. 124 species of birds have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house. There it is. Okay, there are 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of them has to be, got to reduce the area that we have in lawn. We've got over 40 million acres of lawn in this country, and that's a 2005 statistic, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. A status symbol. Now, I know we need to advertise our high status, and we also need places to put our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that's in lawn right now? What if we took areas like this and we started replanting them? I got this picture from Dan Getman. I think he's in Missouri. He had a big lawn like this, and he's doing exactly what we're talking about. He's putting in a whole lot of native plants. This is only the 2nd year of his planting. Well, that would give us 20 million acres that we could essentially restore right at home. And that's enough area to create a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? When we get some part of nature living right with us, we get the opportunity to form a personal relationship with Mother Nature. At our own timing, our own pace, all you have to do is go outside or maybe even just look out the window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people there with you as of last year. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential if you're going to develop that personal relationship with Mother Nature. And it's particularly important for our poor kids, who Richard Lewis says are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, and they go to a natural place, and they walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home. And that is their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside alone, no parental supervision. You know, when you hover over your kids as a parent, you're sending the message that everything is dangerous. That's no way for them to develop a loving relationship with Mother Nature, which is essential because they're the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know how to steward, if they don't know they should be stewarding, if they don't know what they should be stewarding, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives on a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And she sent me this picture when she discovered that to tell me how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard, sneak up on him. You can't, no smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put him in an aquarium, you'll learn how to take care of the lizard. You fall in love with the lizard. You learn what good stewardship is all about. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet because of that. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranisti's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where you live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. It is free. You go to homegrownnationalpark.org, register the location of your property and the amount of area that you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you're reducing the area of lawn. Maybe you're protecting a wood lot. Maybe you're putting a flower pot on a balcony. Whatever you're doing, record that on Homegrown National Park, and your little area of the county is going to light up. So this is our attempt at getting beyond the choir, reaching the people that have no idea that they are essential components of the future of conservation. We want that idea to go viral using a social media platform like this. And eventually, we're working with a tech company right now. Eventually, you will be able to see the whole country light up. We'll be able to see where there are gaps in participation, gaps in our biological corridors. We'll be able to get to see the successful restoration take place. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. What's a keystone plant? Well, this is a Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch falls down. If you take keystone plants out of the local food web, the food web collapses because they're making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're essential. Your house will fall down without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your house after you put your keystone plants in, but they're an essential component of it. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? Ecologically, on average, they certainly are, but there are a lot of native plants that don't do all that much either. The question really is, do we want to plant the species that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, the keystone species in our local ecosystems? I get an email once in a while from somebody saying, don't I know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 caterpillars here today. They do not contribute to the local food web. What contributes more than anything else? One of the oaks. In 84% of the counties in which they occur, oaks are the #1 keystone plant. In the mid-Atlantic states where I live, they support 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. How do you find out what the keystone species are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code and the ranked list of both woody and herbaceous plant genera that support the most life, the most caterpillars, and in this case, the most specialist bees will pop up for your county. These are just, this is not the entire list you're going to get. I stopped because I ran out of room. But notice I say native cherries, native willows, native oaks. If I go to the nursery and say I want to buy a cherry, they're gonna sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia, guaranteed. If I say I want to buy a willow, without specifying, they're going to sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. You've got to specify that you want a native members of these very powerful genera. Otherwise, they'll give you a non-native ornamental, and you'll have 68% fewer caterpillars. We've done that experiment. These are the most important herbaceous genera, goldenrods, the various genera that asters were broken up into, sunflowers, particularly perennial sunflowers. Not only do they support a lot of caterpillars, they also support a lot of specialist bees, those bees that require particular pollens. If you have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers in your yard, you can support at least 40 species of bees that won't be there if you don't have those plants. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone Plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. A lot of research is showing that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, and these are all the ways that lights kill insects, nocturnal insects. But this is actually good news to me. We've got to turn around insect declines. We've lost 45% of the insects on planet Earth. And remember, they're the little things that are keeping us alive on planet Earth. And if we can turn that around by simply flicking a switch, turning off lights, and look, got a lot of lights to turn off, folks. We're getting away easy. But I know what you're going to say. I cannot turn the light out over my garage or my barn or my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you'll notice is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED is the best, because yellow nocturnal insects are far less attracted to yellow wavelengths compared to white or bluish wavelengths. If we substituted yellow bulbs for white bulbs overnight, we could save millions of insects and millions of dollars too if we use LEDs, because they're a lot more energy efficient. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone Plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come and kill all the insects. Mosquito Joe, this is a booming business around the country, you know that. And Mosquito Joe says it's okay because this is a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids. It's been enhanced a little bit, but that's the compound that is found in chrysanthemums. He also says it only kills mosquitoes. And I wish he was right, but it kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including monarchs during migration. The important thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. You don't try to control mosquitoes in the adult stage. In order to do that, you have to kill 90% of them. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50% of the mosquitoes. And he kills a lot of other insects. If you really want to kill mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay, and let it ferment for a while in the warm weather. You're building up populations of diatoms and algae, and that is exactly what mosquito larvae eat. So adult female mosquitoes that want to lay their eggs will lay their eggs in the bucket. Then you go to the harvester and you get a mosquito dunk. Get a sheet for $9. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's one of the strains that only kills aquatic diptera. So you put your dunk in the bucket, the caterpillars or the larvae hatch and they eat the mosquito dunk and they die. So it's extremely targeted. It's cheap. It only kills aquatic diptera. If a dragonfly gets in there, it won't hurt it. If a dog drinks it or a bird drinks it, no problem at all. You might put a coarse screen over it so a chipmunk doesn't jump in and drown. But this is the way. If everybody did this, we would control a lot of mosquitoes without killing anything else. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, this is an example. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from a branch, then it comes out as an adult, then it does it all over again. I wish everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as a caterpillar on the tree, then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the soil surface, pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the soil under the tree, so it's too hard for caterpillars to get under. So this becomes an ecological trap. The typical way that we landscape is drawing in insects. The caterpillars develop on the tree and drop down and die. And I'm convinced this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You have a tree in a yard. We're going to measure, starting this year, this summer, how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you have a layered landscape, soft landing, maybe a dogwood up here, native azalea and ferns, ground cover. Caterpillars drop down. The soil is not compacted. Nobody's going to mow on them. Nobody's going to step on them. They can easily get beneath the soil surface and pupate, or they can spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under there. Much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn, folks. You put big beds around all of your trees, and all of a sudden you have less lawn, all safe sites. Use your ground covers here, the wild ginger, your mayapple, your foam flower, your ferns, all wonderful places for those caterpillars to complete their development. Another grad student, Desiree Narango, well, she's former grad student, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. And that's good news to me. She had one simple question. How well do chickadee populations do over time in landscapes dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by introduced plants? And the first thing she found is that when they're dominated by introduced plants, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, there's 75% less bird food there. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, there's nest boxes up in everybody's yard. That was part of the study. But the chickadees would come, they look around and say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try to reproduce, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. Those nests produced 1.2 fewer fledglings if they did survive, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. So if you put all the data into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of woody non-native plants in the landscape, from none to 100%, we focus on woody plants because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This is what you get. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every day or every year. If you reproduce at that rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population, anything above the line here, and that's when you have very few non-native plants. Or if you make fewer babies than adults die, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population, and that's what you get when you have a lot of non-native woody plant biomass. Right here is where those lines overlap, generously speaking, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants because they are ecological tumors. They escape your yard and they just keep spreading and spreading and spreading, crippling the food web in our natural areas. But there are plenty of ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember this picture, Dan Getman? There's a ginkgo tree. Why does he have a ginkgo tree in his native plant landscape here? He has one because his wife likes ginkgos and she asked him to put one in. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No, it's not. Is it dominating it? No, it's not invasive. There's nothing wrong here. It's not the presence of a non-native plant that destroys the food web. It's the absence of native plants. So if we put more native plants into our yards, we can tolerate more non-natives, or some non-natives anyway. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. Got this last year, I guess. You don't get more formal than that. And that was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor that it's not just a patch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. It's functioning. It's servicing a number of species of bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would certainly help a lot. Let me just remind you why we need pollinators. It's not what you hear. It's not because they pollinate a third of our crops. May Berenbaum, University of Illinois, tells us it's really about 1/12 of our crops that they pollinate. And people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the agriculture argument. We need pollinators, and we need them everywhere because they pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. And again, where do we need them? Every place we need plants. There's a Drew Latham design. Much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program called the Lawn to Legume Program, where the state pays homeowners to reduce or completely replace their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. Very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program. It's much younger, only 2 years old, $5,000 per acre rebate if you replace your lawn with native plants. There's an island off of Florida that's paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species, burrowing owls are listed species. It's the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use part of your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on invasive species like calorie pear. St. Louis, Missouri did that. Fayetteville, Arkansas. South Carolina has banned them altogether. North Carolina has a bounty on it. You take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Or public utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native plants, not just in the Southwest. Buffalo, New York is doing this as well. And of course, the lawn replacement programs in the far West, particularly California, this has gone up. You get $3 per square foot now rebate for every square foot of lawn you take out and put in appropriate xeric plantings. California does not have one drop of rain that it can waste on lawn. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one is a big one. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. If it's optional, it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, that means nature takes a back seat. That mindset is really embedded in our culture today. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out. And there's a wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of nature, of conservation. We want to save nature, save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. And I understand that was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. They're beautiful places. We want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. But again, that reinforces the idea that nature's there just for entertainment. It's far more important than that. We need nature so that we have future generations. A little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about that, but if we restrict conservation just to the areas where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those areas are too small, too few, too isolated. David Quammen has an analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance. Even if we've destroyed it, we've got to put it back. And that includes our yards, our corporate landscapes, our roadsides, even our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We need to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we've already destroyed them by putting the plants back. When we do this, and we've started, but when we do this, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Excuse me. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Excuse me. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said that the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We're very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can turn out their lights, one person can fire Mosquito Joe, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can use Keystone Plants, one person can get rid of the invasive plants that are already on his or her property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can totally revitalize the functional ecosystem where they live and contribute to their greater ecosystem rather than degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the Earth that you can influence. If you own property, that's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or a preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. I think I've convinced my grandkids that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Doug. I don't know about everybody else, but I feel pretty inspired to stay the course. Wonderful.
Good.
Do we have any questions? We've got a couple comments, people that had to jump off, but they have all enjoyed your presentation.
Very good.
And I will, in the follow-up email, there were a couple things that you referenced. I will include, once we have the link to the video, the information on the Homegrown National Park, so you can get your property registered there. And then the Native Plant Finder was also, so you can find Keystone native plants. I've also got a link to, you mentioned soft landings, and there's a handout and visual that I think was developed by you, and then I think Heather Holmes also added to it, so we'll put a link to that. And then I also just wanted to do a plug. We do have a couple questions coming in, but if you have not yet read Nature's Best Hope, this is an amazing book, and towards the back of it on chapter 11 is a section on what each of us can do. So if you need to be reminded of some of the actions that Doug has suggested, definitely get the book. Let's see, thank you so much for hosting. Okay, what plants will help bring in predators for mosquitoes?
Well, a lot of things that eat mosquitoes, both in the larval stage. Just about every aquatic insect is a predator, except mosquitoes. So they're the basis of the food web in lakes and ponds. And the places you get mosquitoes breeding is when you have temporary bodies of water that dry up periodically, so those predators can't be there. So in aquatic systems, they're very important. But when they come out as adults, they are important food for swallows and swifts that scoop them up and martins out of the air. Bats in particular are eating a lot of mosquitoes. Those would be the main ones. So how do you bring in those things? Unfortunately, we've had the white nose disease, which has killed a lot of our bats in the north. there's a little bit of good news there in that they're developing some resistance, but it's kind of a slow rebuild. But you know, so that's another thing. If you have Mosquito Joe and he kills even some of the mosquitoes, you've taken away the bat food. So you know, everything's a trade-off, but it's usually the aerial gleaners that are good at eating adult mosquitoes.
Someone asked dragonflies, question mark.
Oh, dragonflies too. Yes, I forgot dragonflies. Yeah, they're probably eating more than anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
both as naiads when they're in the water, and then as adults when they come out.
Our next question, I think it refers to the tip you had for changing out lights to yellow, and it's, are there many town ordinances that limit light placement or wattage? What is the right question to ask?
I don't think there's any yet. This is new information. In Europe, they're farther ahead of us, and they are making some regulations over here, but I don't know of any in the US. It'd be great. Get your town to be the first one.
Sure. How can I attract bats to my yard? Just put up a bat box?
Bat box will help. You know, I've had one up for years. I don't have any bats nesting in it. Bats like permanent bodies of water. So if you have enough property that you can make a pond on, they will come and they swoop in there at dusk, and they're eating all the things that are flying around that pond. It's usually not mosquitoes. It's midges, chironomids that look like mosquitoes but aren't, that supply a lot of food. So if I said I have to have bats here next year, that's the first thing I would do. I would dig a pond and fill it, and I probably would have bats. Not all bats nest or roost in bat boxes. Several of them roost in solitarily up under the big flakes of hickory bark, like shagbark hickory, or other places. That's all I know about bats.
Bridget asks, I live by the ocean in New York City and have read conflicting information about planting milkweed near the coast. Do you know if they can overwinter by the coast?
Well, I guess it depends. It's not the overwintering, it'd be the salt tolerance. So I'm trying to think if I've ever seen milkweed growing where there's a lot of salt. I can't say that I have, not that I spend a lot of time there, but I think that would be the limitation. I would plant them in an area that doesn't get a lot of salt spray and see how they do. It could be that they're not very salt tolerant, but it won't be the cold. Milkweeds can go up into Canada with no trouble at all.
Any tips for deer ticks?
Yeah, we got to control the deer. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And I know an individual homeowner can't do that, but don't oppose deer cullings, because, you know, when I was growing up, there were no deer ticks, there was no Lyme disease, and there were very few deer. We found a deer footprint in my front yard once, and it was so rare we made a plaster cast of it, and I had it on my dresser for all of my youth. And then, of course, the deer populations exploded. So now they can be 10, 12 times over the carrying capacity. That's what has made the tick populations explode. That's what has made Lyme disease explode. I've had Lyme disease 5 times, so I get it. It's not something we want. So that's the ultimate solution, is control the ticks. Although there's interesting research coming out of the Carey Institute and also some papers from down south that shows as you increase the diversity of animals that get ticks in your yard and in your ecosystem, then tick infectivity goes down. So for example, there are a lot of deer and a lot of ticks in the south, but very little Lyme disease. Why is that? Because they've got a lot of lizards. And it's not that the lizards are eating the ticks, it's that the ticks get on the lizards, and it's a dead end host for the ticks and the Borrelia, the Lyme disease. So the amount of infective ticks that are out there is much lower. And that's true with any of the mammals. So if you have a lot of chipmunks and possums and raccoons and whatever, squirrels, everything else that's around you, it lowers the total infectivity because the ticks are siphoned off onto those non-hosts. They're bad hosts. In terms of living with your property, this is the time of year you have to be vigilant. My wife actually got a deer tick today. And so one of the things you do, you pull it off and put Neosporin right on the spot you took the tick off. Put it on there a couple of times, and that kills the Borrelia before it gets into your capillary system. I had a guy working from University of Pennsylvania working on Lyme disease tell me that years ago. And ever since he told me that, no more Lyme disease. You have to catch the tick though. And for me, it's easy because they itch. They don't itch on everybody, and that makes it more of a challenge. This is why I suggest grass paths and swaths of grass through your yard rather than getting rid of all of your grass. Ticks don't run after you. They climb up on vegetation and they quest. They have their little legs out, and when you walk by, they grab on to your clothing and then they crawl up. So if you minimize your exposure to tall vegetation during late April, May, and June. Those are the peak months of tick infectivity. That will help. There's another product called Daminex, which it's a pyrethroid soaked in cotton, and white-footed mice. That's another part of the cycle. Will take that cotton and build their nest out of it, and because it's got pyrethroids in it, it kills the ticks that are on the mice. I've never used that, but I've heard it works. It works pretty well. So those are tips, but ultimately we've got to get the deer under control. We could reintroduce wolves, that would do it, or cougars. But if that doesn't work, then we're going to have to control the deer other ways.
Wow, who knew all this stuff just with one question about ticks? That's awesome. The next question is, having a water source helpful in attracting wildlife? Would you recommend adding some type of water source to your yard? And what's the best way to add the water source? Any recommendations on water?
Yeah, it can be very simple. Birds love clean water. And what signals clean water is that it's moving. So if even if you have a small water feature, the old bird baths that are just sitting there, they don't attract birds because that's stagnant water and that it's not moving. So they're not attracted to that at all. You want to build something that has very shallow water. They don't want to get in over their legs because they're worried about drowning, I guess. So they want it shallow, but they want it moving. So anything that bubbles water down, it makes little splashes, little teeny pumps. You can get a fish pump that moves water around. Even a dripping hose can be very attractive to birds because moving water signals that it's clean. Now, if you have a stream or a river in your yard, it's not going to be very attractive because there's plenty of water for the birds. But if you're in an area without much water, they will really be attracted to it.
Great. I had trouble planting milkweed from seed. Is there a trick to that? And then related to that, is it true that opossums eat a lot of ticks?
Well, yes and yes. We'll do the possums first, but they don't eat the right ticks. Deer ticks are just too small. So if there's a lot of dog ticks around, the much bigger ones, they will eat them. Are possums going to control your ticks? No, they're not. I mean, I've never seen that happen. Possums are fine. I mean, you don't want to shoot your possums, but I wouldn't count on them for tick control. What was the first question?
Milkweed. How any tricks to planting milkweed from seed?
It depends on the source of seed, but milkweed seeds can have a high degree of non-viability. So that's probably what you've got. You've got milkweed seeds that simply aren't viable, and that's why they're not going to germinate. There's two ways you can get milkweeds easily. One would be to buy plugs. They're already germinated, and you put them right in, and they'll go to town. that you got to buy the plug. So that costs a little bit of money. Another thing you could do is if you have any milkweeds already on your property, a little milkweed patch, the stolons come straight up like this, but the roots, the major root is horizontal underground and it's as thick as my finger. So if you dig up a part of your patch and you get maybe 2-inch sections of that center root and just put that in the ground, that'll send up a new rammet. That's the fastest, easiest, cheapest way to spread your milkweed around.
Right. You talked about oaks, goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers as keystones. Can you name 10 plants you would include in a landscape woody or herbaceous to start your conversion? What would be your top 10?
Yeah, that depends on where you live. But so in Northern Illinois, what would be my top 10? I would have, bur oak is probably the oak that wants to be there. So, we got to have space and we got to have sunlight and all of that stuff. I would get a native prunus. Black cherry is great. Might want to put it in the backyard. A lot of people don't think it's so pretty, but it's a really productive plant. Native willows are very high on the list too. A black willow, if you have any kind of a wet area, it's a perfect place to put it, but it doesn't require wet. But willows are just as high as cherries in terms of being keystone. If you're far enough west to get survivorship out of cottonwoods, they're very high as well. Birches are high, hickories are high. I mean, going down the list now, maples are good. They're a little bit lower. Pines are good. They're a little bit lower, but if I'm putting in 10, I would certainly include them. Have I gotten to 10 woodies yet? You want to have a layered landscape. So you want some shrubs too. Definitely get your viburnums in there. The native viburnums that belong where you are. It's probably going to be arrowwood viburnum and a few others.
You got room for one more.
One more, yeah. Well, there's a number of shrubby things like Ilex verticillata and buttonbush and clethra, sweet pepper bush that are not keystone plants in terms of making caterpillars, but they certainly are really important for native pollinators. You don't want to forget the pollinators in that mix there. And we're not overloaded with species of shrubs. So you definitely want to focus on those. Those guys I just mentioned, by the way, can grow in standing water. Again, they don't need it, but if you have a wet area, you certainly want to include them. And then you can move to the herbaceous plants where you definitely want your sunflowers, you definitely want your goldenrods, you definitely want your asters, particularly fall asters, because they're so important to give nectar to monarchs when they're migrating. They need fuel all the way down to Mexico. And when you get into the late migrating monarchs, late October, there's very few things blooming other than even the goldenrods passed at that point. It's those late blooming asters that really make the difference for the monarchs.
Yep. I'll do a little plug for our Summer Blooms plant sale. Those are, we've specialized in goldenrods, sunflowers, and late blooming asters.
Well,
so
there you go.
We'll be doing that sale in June and July. The next one is, it's not a question, it's just Damonex. I don't know if the person's wondering what that might be.
That's that product that I was talking about for the ticks. It's a tube with cotton in it, and the cotton has pyrethroids in it, and you just lay them around your property.
If the person researches clipping / water germination method, you can improve sprouts. Oh, that's for the milkweed germination. So the person, Hannah, asked about milkweed seeds. If you research clipping / water germination method, you can improve your sprouting. The question about Damonex was how to spell it. Daminex.
Okay.
I don't know.
I don't know. Ask the Google. The Google knows everything.
It might be an interesting result, but any other final questions? We're wrapping up on our time limit here with Doug. I think we've got all the questions covered as far as I can tell. Thank you so much, Doug. This was wonderful, and again, very inspirational. I think I'm going back to my garden with a renewed sense of urgency,
Good. Good.
purchasing many of these plants. And I hope everyone enjoyed the session this evening and found it useful. And you'll be joining us again in August. We're going to go smaller and talk a little bit about little things that run the world and get even more into relationships.
All right. Well, have a good spring then. See you in August.